the war machine of ancient Rome. Skilled, efficient, only as strong as the sum of its parts. The man in the line, the strength of an empire. It all rests on him. But he does more than just fighting. The everyday routine, responsibilities, and experiences of the warriors who established and protected an ancient empire are the subjects of our journey today into the world of the Roman Republic soldier. From the youthful front-line hastati to the seasoned triarii, the agile skirmishing velites, to the proud cavalry equites, we focus today on behind the scenes. How did a Roman army conduct itself between the battles? Allow me first to welcome you to the channel. If you're new here, it's good to meet you. We're going to go into quite a deep dive today. If you like this sort of thing, you best like and subscribe, or perhaps consider checking out the Patreon. But with that being said, let's get nice and comfortable. In order to provide a realistic portrayal of what life was like in the legions, I'm going to discuss the everyday routine struggles and, of course, the grim realities of campaigning. There's going to be some graphic details where appropriate. If you're not fluent in Cicero's language, don't worry. All Latin terms are going to be explained in English for clarity too, so you might learn a bit of Latin along the way. Let's set the scene with a quick summary of how the Roman soldier's experience evolved throughout the Roman Republic, before delving into the specifics of camp life and even the brutal realities of combat. The roles and lives of different kinds of soldiers in the Republican Legion will then be discussed, and lastly we're going to have a look at what a typical day on campaign might have been like. And that includes the routines, the work, the camaraderie, and of course all the ruthless killing. Of course, we can't go past the discipline that held everything together, and that is a topic of its own. So let's talk about first the Roman soldier in the early, middle, and late Republic. Now the Roman Republic, remember, that's different from the Roman Empire, and it lasted for nearly 5 centuries, that is from 509 BC to 27 BC. Both the army structure and soldiers' daily lives underwent substantial change during that period, so we can't just use a blanket term, though we are going to do our best to speak in general terms when we can. We do have to make our timelines known. The army itself was a citizen militia of landowners during the early Republic, so we're talking the 5th and 4th centuries BC, or BCE for those who prefer the latter convention. Military service was arranged according to age and wealth, but regardless, it was regarded as a civic obligation. Roman citizens were divided into property classes based on their role in combat, according to an old tradition ascribed to King Servius Tullius. Heavy infantry were reserved for those who could afford their own weapons and armor. Poorer citizens served as light troops, or were simply not allowed to serve at all, while the wealthiest fought as cavalry equites, and the first class formed the heavily armed front lines. Campaigns during this early stage were seasonal. Soldiers would leave for battle in the summer and return to their farms for the harvest. Because soldiers were expected to supply their own equipment and support themselves, there was no standing army, and, at first, no regular pay, which primarily restricted service to those with resources. This system did change as the number of conflicts in Rome increased. State pay for service began when Rome instituted a stipend. The soldiers in the 4th century BC, which we have the old Latin term for this stipendium, which is where we get the word from, you'll be surprised how many of our modern words are actually coming from Latin, and ancient Greek too, especially a lot of medical terms. Later writers claim that the need for longer service emerged during the siege of Veii in early 4th century BC. The early Republican soldier was still a part-time fighter. He was a tradesman or a farmer, more likely, who took up arms when necessary. There wasn't this idea of a career military man, at least not quite yet. Early Roman history provides us with examples of the value placed on discipline, such as the tale of Titus Manlius Torquatus, who executed his own son, that's right, his own son, in 340 BC, for defying orders and fighting the enemy against orders. Even in the early days, such stories, which Livy documented, demonstrated the ideal of Roman discipline. The Roman army had grown more organized and skilled by the Middle Republic, 3rd to 2nd centuries BC, when it fought Carthage and their Hellenistic kingdoms. This is the era of the Manipular Legion, described in detail by Greek historian Polybius, who wrote in the mid-2nd century BC. Polybius was deeply interested in how Rome, I quote, in less than 53 years, brought under her rule almost the whole world, and he identified Rome's military system and discipline as key factors. Of course, when we say the whole world, this is the world according to what was known at the time. In his Histories, Book 6, Polybius outlines the organization of a legion in the 2nd century BC. Approximately 4,000 to 5,000 Roman infantry, divided by age and experience into 4 lines: the velites, hastatae, principes, and triarii, along with 300 equites, the cavalry per legion. Always good to have at the flanks. Polybius explains that at the yearly levy the tribunes would sort the recruits by age and wealth. They chose the youngest and poorest to form the velites. Next to them are made hastatae, those in the prime of life, principes, and the oldest of all triarii, these being the names among the Romans of the 4 classes in each legion, distinct in age and equipment. From Polybius' Histories, 621. This manipular system, often called the triplex archies, the triple battle line, defined the soldier's role and experience. We will explore each of these roles shortly. In the late Republic, 1st century BC, there were even more changes, particularly with the reforms traditionally attributed to Gaius Marius, very famous man around 107 BC. I've done a full biography on him if you're interested. You'll get the details. Marius opened enlistments to the capitecensi, the poorest citizens with no property, and reorganized the legions, effectively abolishing the old distinctions of hastatae, principe, and triarii. The legions became more homogeneous heavy infantry units, organized into cohorts, each cohort a tactical unit of about 480 men. This replaced the manipular system. Soldiers of this late period were full-time professionals, often volunteering for long terms of service, that is 16 years or more. And of course, they expected good pay, and a lot of them wanted land grants on retirement, so you better make sure that you're adding more land to what would eventually become the empire, because you've got to get that land from somewhere, don't you? They also carried more of their own equipment and supplies, reducing the baggage train, a change so marked the soldiers humorously earned the nickname Marius's mules, muli Mariani. Plutarch, in his biography of Marius, and believe me, Plutarch does some great biographies, notes that on campaign Marius, I quote, compelled them to carry their own baggage and to prepare their own food. Hence, in after times, men who were fond of toil and did whatever was enjoined upon them without a murmur were called Marian mules. That is from Plutarch, Life of Marius, section 13. As a result, the late Republican soldier was both burdened and more independent, carrying a bulky pack of rations, cookware, bedding, and tools in addition to his arms and armor. I'm thinking somewhat of Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings with all of his little pots and little packets of salt and pepper, things like this. Now, back to the topic. Some elements of daily life in the Republic stayed the same, in spite of these organizational changes. Any Roman soldier had to put up with severe discipline too, intense training, and the hardships of a long-distance campaign. He rose before dawn, marched for hours under scorching sun, set up camps in the evening, and stood watch on chilly nights, and faced the very real possibility of being wounded or even killed in battle. It didn't matter if he was a conscripted farmer in 300 BC or a career legionary in 50 BC. The threat of death always lingered. In order to better comprehend these experiences, let's take a look at the various soldier types in the mid-Republican army. We have the traditional model of the hastati, principes, and triarii, etc. It might help you understand their roles and status. Next, after that, we'll explore their daily routines and perhaps some of the little details. Every soldier's experience in a Roman Republican legion was influenced by his position on the front line. Triplex Asius derives from the fact that the legion, legio, was usually organized into 3 ranks for combat. So let's give each group a bit of an introduction. At this time, they mostly used throwing spears called pila, but the word hastati, singular being hastatus, literally means spearmen. Usually younger men in their late teens or 20s. These were put on the infantry front line. The hastati were the second youngest group after the veiletes, according to Polybius. Their equipment may have been a little lighter than the of the older principes, because they were less experienced and frequently had less money. You see, in the past, a hastatus might have been able to afford a simple bronze chest piece, often called a pectoral, instead of a full mail shirt. But by the 2nd century BC, many hastati had a full panoply, as Polybius puts it, which included a bronze helmet, greaves on the legs, and a sword, gladius hispaniensis, that being a Spanish sword, and the word Hispania, on the right hip, and a large oblong shield, the scutum, 2 heavy javelins, pila, to throw at the enemy too. By this time they had abandoned carrying long spears, which was the speciality of the triarii, despite being named hastati from hasta, spear. The hastati were usually the first to engage the enemy in combat, using their pila to break the enemy line before engaging in close combat with the sword. Because the hastatus was frequently the first to bleed, it was risky to be in the front ranks. But if you had the stones for it, maybe even a little exciting. According to a Roman proverb, ad triarios redisse, it has come down to the triarii, which indicates that the first 2 lines, hastati and principes, have failed in a desperate situation. This suggests that since the hastati were the initial test of the enemy's strength, it was anticipated that they might not always win. Well, next we have the principes, singular being princeps, or leading men. These were the second line, made up of men who, according to Polybius, were in their prime, or in their late 20s or possibly mid-30s. Typically, principes were more experienced combatants who had demonstrated their abilities as hastati in earlier battles, getting a promotion of sorts, I suppose. They frequently had little more money or had improved their equipment through experience and perhaps looting. Their helmet, often with a plume or crest, gladius sword, scutum shield, and pila, were all very similar to those of the hastati. With the exception of the triarii spears, Polybius claims that the princeps and triarii are armed in the same manner as the hastati, Polybius 6:23-14. Thus, a princeps wielded javelin in a more hastati-like fashion. On the battlefield, the principes typically engaged after the hastati had either defeated the enemy or been driven back. The principes would advance to carry out the battle if the first line faltered and fell back through the openings. Therefore, if a princeps needed to be prepared to intervene in a tumultuous conflict and change the outcome, and they certainly jumped in quite quickly when they had the chance. In many battles, they formed the infantry's backbone of the legion. It is conceivable that the somewhat older men, principes frequently served as kind of mentors to the younger members of the hastati, imparting their knowledge of camp life and keeping their composure throughout the battle. Triarii. Singular. Triarius. These were the third line, the veterans of the legion. Typically, men in their late 30s or 40s, or even older. They were still fit for battle. Don't write them off. Polybius notes the triarii were the oldest and were fixed at 600 per legion, normally 20 maniples of 30 triarii each, since they were half the number of the hastati or principes. The triarii were armed somewhat differently. You see, instead of a pila, they carried a longer spear or pike called a hasta. This harks back to the older style of fighting. Indeed, early Roman armies before the manipular system fought in a Greek-style phalanx with spears, and the triarii preserved a bit of that old tradition. After all, they were of the previous generation, right? In battle, the triarii were used only in emergencies, or the climactic moment. Often they knelt or crouched behind the front lines as the battle began, conserving their strength. If the battle went well, the triarii might not even fight at all. But if things went poorly, you would generally hear that rallying cry, ad triarios, to the triarii, meaning that the last line must hold. It was a point of pride that the triarii were steadfast. The Roman historian Livy uses the phrase rem ad triarios retice. The matter has come down to the triarii to signify a crisis, but also the hope that veterans would salvage the situation. It's kind of like telling your dad when you're being bullied by someone at school. I suppose it's like that. The triarius had seen many battles, of course. Perhaps he would have been wounded by multiple times too, and earned the respect of younger soldiers. Outside of battle, he might have a slightly more privileged position. For example, Polybius mentions that triarii maniples were excused from certain menial duties like some camp chores or fetching wood for the tribunes, as a mark of honor, but they still did guard duty, such as night watchers or overseeing the camp's horses. A triarius could regale the campfire with old war stories, and, as we will see, accumulated long lists of campaigns and honors. There's a famous example of Spurius Ligustinus, a triarius-level centurion, whose speech Livy records as follows. He boasted of 34 battles and 6 crowns, awards for saving fellow citizens in combat, over 22 years of service, and said he had been first centurion of the triarii 4 times. Such a career gives a sense of how veteran Triarius might actually see himself. As a hardened survivor of many trials, owed a certain respect by the youngsters, but he's still ready to get his hands dirty if Rome calls. I like that. The old, tough guy. I'm thinking of Jason Statham in one of those helmets, something like that. Now as for the Weletes. Now don't get confused, that is spelled with a V at the start if you are going to look it up. It is pronounced Weletes or singular Weles. These were the light infantry skirmishers, typically the youngest and least wealthy soldiers in the legion. Polybius describes them as the youngest and poorest selected at the levy. The Veles did not have the heavy armor of a legionary. He carried a small round shield called a parma, about 90 centimeters across, a bundle of light javelins, and a short sword too. They also wore light helmets, often decorated with a piece of fur or a wolf's skin. As Polybius notes, they sometimes covered their helmets with a wolf's skin or something similar to act as a distinguishing mark, so officers could identify their brave deeds. The Veletes were deployed as skirmishers ahead of the main lines. Their job was to harass and whittle down the enemy with javelins, target opposing skirmishers, and screen the deployment of heavier troops. They might dart forward to throw their spears at, say, an oncoming war elephant or chariot. Indeed, at the Battle of Zama against Hannibal, Roman Veletes helped distract the Carthaginian elephants. Veletes had to be swift and agile, spreading out in open order. Once the heavy infantry engagement began, they would retreat through the gaps in lines or to the flanks, essentially clearing the field for the clash of the main forces. Despite being lightly equipped, their role was dangerous. They were most exposed during the initial phase of the battle. In camp and on marches, Veletes likely did not carry as much weight as the heavy infantry, but they weren't exempt from labor. They shared the toil of digging trenches or standing guard, no exceptions. They also had the least status. A youth in his first campaign as a Veles might have to prove himself with courage and reliability to perhaps be promoted into the future ranks of hastati. A bit of ancient wisdom. Even in slowly roll, there was room for valor. Think about that one. The army did recognize brave young soldiers. After battles, generals might single out daring Veletes for a reward. The Roman ethos was that virtus, courage or manliness, could be shown by rich and poor alike, and many a decorated centurion started as a poor Veles, throwing javelins on the skirmish line. Well, no matter what position you're in, if you're going to be a Velete, be the best damn Velete that Rome has ever seen. Well, we arrive now to the equites, singular, eques. You might recognize the modern word equine for horses, and guess what? Another Latin root for that word. These were, of course, the cavalrymen, the mounted soldiers of the Republic. In the early and middle Republic, the equites were drawn from the wealthier classes, originally from aristocracy and those propertied people who could afford a war horse, which I'm sure I don't need to tell you that would have been quite expensive. Each legion had an attached cavalry contingent, often around 300 Roman equites, divided into 10 squadrons, being turmae of 30 men. Allied legions would have their own cavalry as well. The equites were armed with a spear or a light lance along with a sword. They usually carried a lighter circular shield. As for their armor, many wore a bronze cuirass or a mail shirt and an Attic-style helmet. The cavalrymen were quite prestigious. They had a social rank, kind of like knights. But on the battlefield, they sometimes had a frustrating role, as Roman cavalry in this era were not as dominant as their infantry. Often Roman commanders relied on allied cavalry like Numidian horsemen or Gauls, perhaps Spaniards, to augment their own. Still, the life of an equus involved lots of riding, scouting ahead of the army, screening flanks, pursuing fleeing enemies, and engaging enemy cavalry. Their daily routine included care of their horses. Feeding, grooming, and exercising their mounts was a crucial duty every morning and evening. An equus might have one or more servants or grooms, or perhaps slaves, to help, especially if he was a very high-status young noble. This means in camp an equus possibly had a bit more comfort. He might not personally be digging ditches if he could help it, though discipline applied to them too, of course. Polybius mentions that in camp each triarius maniple provided guards for the squadron of horses behind them, to watch the horses at night, indicating the integration of infantry and cavalry even in camp security. So, cavalry troopers enjoyed status, but they also bore the responsibility of mobility. They often had to ride out on long patrols or sudden dashes. They could also be exposed to great danger when isolated. Of course, Roman history has plenty of episodes where cavalry detachments are ambushed. I can't go through all of them. I will in a different video. Nonetheless, being an equus was often a stepping stone in a young aristocrat's career. Many politically ambitious young men served in the cavalry. For example, I'm sure you know about Julius Caesar. When he was 17 years old, he was actually an equus in the siege of Mytilene. That's starting early, isn't it? By the late Republic, the traditional citizen cavalry in legions was diminishing. It became more common to use allied or mercenary cavalry. But in the period we focus on, the equites are still an integral part of the Roman army structure. Each of these types of soldiers had a distinct equipment, and their own distinct roles. But what bound them together was the daily grind of military life. A famous quote from the historian Vegetius, although he wrote later in the 4th century AD, he was describing earlier practices, states, "Victory in war does not depend entirely upon numbers or mere courage. Only skill and continual discipline will ensure it." Roman soldiers were expected to be skilled, disciplined, and physically tough, regardless of rank, be it a young Veles or a veteran Triarius. Certain routines and hardships were shared by all. And so now, we shift from the structure of the legion to the day-to-day reality. What exactly is it like to walk in the shoes of a Roman soldier? What was a day in the life of a Roman soldier on campaign like? Well, let's find out. So I will invite you for a moment to picture a Roman army moving through deep enemy territory. It's a rigorous and unrelenting pragmatic routine. Morning. The day of a Roman soldier usually started at dawn, or even earlier. The wake-up call was sounded by horns or trumpets. Every member of the disciplined army had a specific task to complete in order to pack up the camp. Soldiers shared a small squad, a tent group, usually consisting of 8 men, later called a contubernium, and lived in leather tents called papiliones. The tents needed to be struck and either carried or packed onto mules at dawn. Every man would also have a basic breakfast, which was typically a kind of hard tack or a small amount of grain porridge. A Roman soldier's usual ration consisted primarily of wheat, which he or his fellow campers would grind and prepare. Pulse, a type of grain-based porridge, was a pretty typical meal. If baking facilities were available, there might also be bread, but you didn't even get that a lot of the time. If you were pretty lucky, you might have some cheese or olives. But most of the time you weren't lucky. The troops were refreshed by drinking water or posca, which was a concoction of sour wine vinegar and water together that was a lot safer than drinking plain water. The army would march after dismantling the camp and gathering in groups. In ideal circumstances, the march might cover 15 to 20 Roman miles, and that's about 22 to 30 kilometers in a single day. In heavy equipment, soldiers frequently marched in formation through fields or along roads. In addition to supplies, a mid-republic principes or hastatus may have his armor, mail or breastplate, helmet, shield, sword, and 2 pila. It's a lot to carry. By the late republic, a legionary notably carried even more. In addition to armor and weapons, he carried a personal kit and pack called a sarcina. Tools like a shovel or pickaxe, saw, basket for moving dirt or a cooking pot, and stakes for the camp palisade were all strapped to the soldier. Or if he had one, his pack animal, according to one account ascribed to Marius's reforms. Therefore, a Roman column on the march was not just a group of men brandishing spears. It was also a group of men carrying equipment, stumbling along with resolute strides. It is understandable why those Marian mules came to represent perseverance, don't you think? Marching was frequently conducted in harsh weather, such as the scorching Italian sun, torrential rain, or the chilly mountain air. But discipline was upheld. It had to be. The pace was set by the officers, centurions, and the column would occasionally stop for a brief rest so that men could reload and drink water. Vegetius, an ancient author, highlights that Roman recruits were trained by continuous marching to develop stamina. It was expected that they would be able to march 20 miles and still be in combat condition at the end. It was not acceptable, however, to struggle. In fact, maintaining ranks during a march was a source of pride, and a soldier who fell behind could face punishment. In later times, Julius Caesar was known to put his soldiers through a particular amount of hardship. According to Suetonius, Caesar would occasionally march his army far beyond their usual range, day and night, simply to test their readiness. He kept them so well hardened that they could react at any time. This instilled a sense of mental and physical toughness, as one might certainly imagine. Caesar's legionaries famously boasted that, loaded with pack and weapons, they could cover vast distances quickly, which often gave the Romans a strategic advantage, appearing where the enemy did not expect them so soon. Perhaps the most defining daily ritual of a Roman army on campaign was the construction of a castra, a fortified camp, every evening. The Roman army rarely slept in the open without fortifications, especially in hostile territory. Every day after marching, no matter how tired, the legions would spend an hour or more building a camp. The site would be chosen by scouts and officers ahead of time, looking for defensible ground with water supply and forage. On arrival, the soldiers didn't just drop everything and rest immediately. They first set to work. The layout of a Roman camp was standardized. In fact, Polybius in Book 6 gives a famous detailed description of a consular camp's design, down to the very streets and gates. Each century, or maniple, knew its designated area, and they did not deviate from it. Soldiers immediately began excavating a ditch around the perimeter and hurling dirt inside to create a rampart known as a vallum after receiving the order. Depending on the dimensions, a typical ditch could be 7 to 10 feet wide and 5 feet or more deep. Each soldier carried 1 or 2 wooden stakes to be used for fixing sharpened stakes into the top of the rampart. With a gate on each side, towers or raised areas sporadically, and a well-fenced enclosure, the camp was essentially a fortress of wood and earth when it was finished. Very impressive, especially for an hour or so. Digging, chopping, and pounding stakes were all labor-intensive aspects of this daily entrenchment. Imagine a normal Astartes following a strenuous march. He's sweating and his shoulders hurt from the weight of his pack and shield, but he must stop. He must pick up the shovel and begin digging before nightfall. There was this idea that sweat saves blood, and this guided their actions. By putting in an effort, they protected themselves from unexpected assaults. Polybius praised this Roman custom, pointing out that while Greek armies frequently neglected to fortify their camps, the Romans always made sure to do so, even when the enemy was nowhere to be found. Of course, tents were set up inside the camp after the fortifications were completed. 8 men would erect their leather tents and set up their sleeping quarters. Every unit had a specific location, and there were even streets in the camp. The main ones were the Via Principalis and the Via Praetoria, which intersected close to the general's tent. There were also areas for commanders, horses, and of course baggage. In larger camps, there was even a forum or market where traders could set up stalls to sell goods or food to the troops, since soldiers enjoyed better food when they could actually purchase it. Wine, for example, was a treasured extra beyond that vinegar-water ration. And don't forget the evening routine. Soldiers were able to finally relax after setting up the camp, but their labor was not entirely finished. They were required to take shifts on guard duty, maintain their equipment, and prepare their meals. The soldiers typically ate whatever they could make with their rations for dinner, which was typically a wheat bread or porridge. In order to turn the grain into flour, each group carried hand mills. If they were very fortunate, they might have some meat, because occasionally the army gets livestock or a herd may be driven with the baggage for fresh meat. If not, soldiers may go hunting or purchase a piece of pork or chicken from a local trader or camp follower. To improve the stew, you could also add some salt pork or bacon to the pot, if you had it on you. In order to augment the diet, the Roman soldiers also collected fruits, nuts, and wild greens whenever they could. Men would take care of their armor and weapons after eating. Now that was an important duty. As Polybius points out, a pilum's point is frequently bent on impact by the design to prevent the enemy from throwing it back, so they would straighten or replace the points in preparation for the next battle. They would also oil the leather straps, repair any damaged shields or scutum coverings, sharpen swords, and make sure their 2 pila were completely intact. Although there was always the flicker of campfires and the murmur of conversation, the camp would gradually become quieter as night fell. In addition to writing letters, if they were literate, many soldiers could at least dictate letters home to a scribe, by the way. Soldiers also told stories, and possibly just hung around, singing their little songs, telling their jokes. During these nights, camaraderie was crucial, because the legion was a community, and tentmates frequently became like family. But the night was not without interruption. There was always a Roman camp under guard. The night was broken up into watches, usually 4 of which lasted 3 hours each. Patrols went around to make sure everything was okay, and guards were stationed at the gates and the ramparts. Dozing off while on duty was regarded as one of the most horrific crimes. In fact, it was regarded so that it was a capital offense. It was well known that Roman discipline was rigorous in this area. The way the Romans enforced night watches is described by Polybius. A patrol leader would carry a wooden tablet known as a tessera, and each guard post had to sign off on it to demonstrate they were on guard. By dawn, the tessera was returned to the tribune. Strict penalties were imposed for any watchers found to be slack or for missing tesseras. What penalty? Fustuarium. Fustuarium, excuse me, which is frequently translated as cudgeling. Basically, they beat you to death. And that was the norm, at least according to Polybius. If found guilty of sleeping at his post, the offending soldier would just be bludgeoned to death by his fellow soldiers. Now that's going to send a warning. It might sound a little bit shocking, but the Romans brutally enforced this rule because they thought that one man's laxity could jeopardize the entire camp. The Roman army's night watches are most scrupulously kept, according to Polybius, because of the extreme severity and inevitableness of the penalty. In other words, fear kept everyone awake when they were on duty. There is grim evidence, actually, that such discipline did work. Ancient sources recount that Roman soldiers would sometimes choose death in battle over the shame of failure. Polybius notes cases where if a man lost his shield in battle, which is a great disgrace, he might throw himself recklessly against the enemy to either recover it or die trying. It's better than facing the punishment and the humiliation. The collective punishment known as decimation is another famous Roman practice. If a whole unit broke in cowardice, 1 in 10 men was randomly executed as punishment. For example, during the Second Punic War, there were instances where units that fled were decimated. And later, Crassus, in the war against Spartacus, 71 BC, late Republic, actually used decimation on his legions to instill terror and obedience. Thus, the night in camp was a mix of much-needed rest for most, and vigilant guard for some. A typical soldier, if not on watch, might be exhausted enough to sleep soundly on his simple bedroll or cot, perhaps a cloak on straw, despite the distant bark of orders or the shuffle of the patrol. But before sleeping, you can't forget, a pious Roman might offer a small prayer to the gods, perhaps to Jupiter, or Mars, or his personal guardian spirits, known as legionaries, for safety and victory. Religion was quietly present in a soldier's life. Camps had altars, and every morning and evening, bugle calls the soldiers might salute the standards or the heavens, maintaining a ritual sense that the gods watched over the fate of the army. This routine repeated day after day on campaign. Wake, march, work, eat, sleep, and remain ready to fight at a moment's notice. This went on for months, as campaigns did, with only occasional breaks. Sometimes in bad weather, the army might stay put for a day, but even then drills or fortification work might be ordered. The Roman soldier was rarely idle. Idleness is considered the enemy of discipline. So let's talk about training and unit cohesion, along with continuing this form of discipline that we're talking about. Roman soldiers were effective due to rigorous discipline and rigorous training, in addition to routine. Now, we've already discussed discipline using the example of punishments, But let's also talk about training and how soldiers developed the skills necessary to carry out those taxing duties. A recruit went through drills as soon as he joined. A lot of training took place in winter quarters or at the beginning of a campaign in the early and mid-Republic. When not engaged in combat, legions that evolved into standing forces during the late Republic, like Caesar's legions in Gaul, continued their training. Despite writing much later, Vegetius, an ancient military writer, preserved the descriptions of training techniques that probably mirrored long-standing customs. He claims that the Romans used wooden swords that were twice as heavy as the real ones and wicker shields to train their recruits, who practiced twice a day by sparring against a post. This meant that a man would feel light and manageable when he entered actual combat with a real gladius and scutum. Additionally, recruits were instructed to thrust rather than slash with the sword, as the stabbing wound exposes the swordsman less and is more likely to result in death. A Roman infantryman was a disciplined fighting machine by the time he faced an enemy, which can be explained by such thorough, almost scientific training. In fact, Polybius attributed Rome's victory over physically more powerful Gauls, or more numerous adversaries, to their, I quote, continual military training and strict discipline in the camps. See Vegetius as well. The Romans owed the conquest of the world to no other cause than their training and discipline, probably echoing earlier sentiment too. Centurions, of course, were essential for training and preserving discipline. In the late Republic structure, these were the senior officers, each of whom oversaw 100 men, or a maniple of 120 in the previous structure. A vitis, or vinewood staff, was a common weapon carried by centurions as a mark of rank and a means of reprimanding soldiers. They strictly enforced orders. He was described as a principe anteferendus, to be placed on the front line, and verberibus disciplinum exigens, exacting discipline with blows, in a well-known centurion's epitaph. These men set an example in combat, and didn't think twice to flog when needed. While major infractions, as we've mentioned, could result in execution or demotion, minor ones could earn a soldier a beating, or just additional responsibilities. Positively, rewards and recognition were used to balance discipline. Roman leaders were aware that pride and honor could inspire just as much fear. Generals gathered to honor valiant soldiers following battles, and everybody wanted that honor. According to Polybius, individuals who stood out would receive official praise and presents, such as a spear for the man who injured an enemy, a decorated cup for the person who killed and stripped an enemy during a hand-to-hand combat, or horse trappings for cavalry. The coveted corona civica, the oak civic crown, may be given to soldiers who save a citizen's life in combat, while the corona moralis, the wall crown, may be given to the first person to breach an enemy wall during a siege. These honors carried significant prestige, in addition to being symbolic. For example, a soldier who won the civic crown could expect to be greeted by a standing applause from all Romans if he participated in the public games. The veteran Spurius Legistinus proudly lists his accolades in Livy's accounts. My commanders have rewarded me for my courage. 4.5 times I have received 6 civic crowns. Similar to medals today, these honors were worn on the breastplate during parades and victories. They served as a strong motivator for soldiers to display their bravery. For Roman soldiers, virtus meant excellence, bravery, and manliness. Units of exceptional cohesion and effectiveness were produced by this combination of carrot and stick, severe punishment for failure or disobedience, and a high reward for bravery and success. A legion took pride in its track record too. Caesar's 10th legion, for instance, was well known for its bravery and loyalty. He would lovingly refer to them as my 10th, and they were indeed loyal to him to the end. In order to foster camaraderie, Suetonius describes how Caesar referred to his soldiers as comrades rather than just soldiers. He also relates how, following a particularly difficult battle, the only loss that Caesar's army ever experienced against Pompey at Dyrrhachium in 48 BC, the soldiers felt so humiliated that they demanded punishment for themselves, and Caesar was forced to comfort them rather than punish. Working together under a lot of stress for a long time, that's what creates a familial bond like that. Soldiers in the late Republic started to show a great deal of loyalty to both their generals and Rome, which ultimately contributed to civil wars. Even in the past, though a charismatic or well-respected leader, such as Scipio Africanus during the Second Punic War, could motivate his troops to exhibit remarkable fortitude. Well, it can't all be accolades and applauses. Let's talk about some of the harsh realities. The weather, the hunger, the fighting. So far we discussed routine and discipline. But what about the extraordinary hardships that Roman soldiers faced? War is famous for not being very fun, but also long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. But also, for ancient soldiers, periods of intense privation. Keeping thousands of soldiers fed was always a challenge, especially back in those days. Usually, the army had supply lines, or lived off the land by foraging and requisition. But things went wrong sometimes. Soldiers could be on short rations, or even starving. There are numerous instances of Roman troops enduring hunger. During Caesar's campaigns, for example, at the siege of Dyrrhachium, Caesar's troops were cut off from their supplies. They resorted to eating wild plants, and even made a kind of bread from local herbs. Suetonius relates that Pompey's men, after overrunning one of Caesar's deserted camps, found these loaves of herb bread. I wonder if they were all right. Maybe. Pompey said that he was fighting wild beasts when he saw that Caesar's men could eat such bread, and he ordered loaves hidden so that his own troops wouldn't be demoralized by the enemy's astonishing endurance. So it looks like Pompey was not a fan of the bread. Another famous incident occurred in Spain in 49 BC. Caesar's legions, isolated by floods near Ilerda, made bread from a root called cara, and when the Pompeian army taunted them about starvations, Caesar's men threw the loaves into the enemy camp to show that they would not yield easily. This grim determination in the face of hunger was a point of pride. Less dramatically, even in normal operations, Roman soldiers had to carry up to 2 weeks of grain, or be ready to forage. If supply was low, they might receive barley instead of wheat, which was considered to be frankly, a humiliating downgrade. Barley was fed to animals, or used to punish troops. As Polybius mentions that as part of his decimation, the remaining men were given barley rations, not wheat, until they redeemed themselves. Thirst was also a problem in forced marches. Soldiers carried water in skins, but in dry regions, dehydration could kill. Commanders like Alexander, though Macedonian, not Roman, famously shared his hardships by refusing water if there wasn't enough for all. This was a practice that Roman generals sometimes emulated to keep up morale. Roman armies campaigned in a variety of climates too. from the heat of North Africa and Spain to the damp cold of northern Gaul and the forests of Germany. Of course, they did not have modern weatherproof gear. A soldier did have a cloak, though, called a sagum for cold and rain, but that was about it. We hear of soldiers suffering in the snow in the Alps, or shivering on sentry duty during a cold night. Livy, in describing the aftermath of the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC, notes that many wounded Romans on that field had their wounds stiffened by the morning cold, causing agony. Cold could be as deadly as the sword. Conversely, heat stroke and sunburn were issues in the Mediterranean summers, marching in heavy armor under a July sun in Apulia, southern Italy. Well, that must have been torture. Despite it all, Roman troops were expected to shrug off the hardships. It's just part of life. A phrase attributed to was patiens laboris, enduring of labor. They trained to swim rivers in full kit, to march barefoot if needed. Roman sandals, the caligae, were sturdy, but in emergencies they'd simply go without. And of course, they were trained to sleep on the ground. The idea was that a Roman soldier always had to be tougher than his enemies, and not just the human ones. Caesar had once bragged that his men, even when outnumbered and besieged, bore hunger and toil so stoically that the enemy was astonished. This is the Dyrrhachium anecdote once again. It became almost a competition of honor. To suffer without complaint was a mark of a true Roman soldier. Men who grumbled were ridiculed as weaklings. That being said, soldiers certainly did complain at times. There were minor mutinies over pay or conditions in the late Republic, but the ideal promoted in our sources is the iron soldier, who, like the mythical hero, eats wild roots and smiles. But starvation wasn't the only thing you had to worry about. While ancient accounts focus on the battle glory or heroic endurance of hunger, the quieter killer of armies was disease. Crowded camps with poor sanitation are breeding grounds for dysentery, typhus, or other illnesses. Roman camps, however, were relatively sanitary for the time. They typically dug latrine pits and had specified areas for waste. This slightly helped, but still, on long campaigns, many soldiers would fall ill. We have few vivid stories about this. Ancient historians paid a little bit less attention to disease unless it was a plague. But we do know that in some sieges or long encampments, diseases might have fell more men than the enemy managed to. And this isn't just for the Romans either. This is pretty much just for war in general. For instance, during the Second Punic War, large Roman armies in southern Italy suffered fevers from the malarial swamps. Later, in Julius Caesar's siege of Dyrrhachium, both Caesars, and thus Pompey's camps, had sickness due to the cramped conditions. The daily life of a soldier thus also included trying to stay healthy, eating whatever rations he had, boiling water if possible. Posca, the vinegar drink, did have mild antiseptic properties, and hoping that the surgeons were available if he got wounded or sick. Each legion had some medical staff. They could amputate limbs, bandage wounds, and treat common ailments with the rudimentary medicine of the time, herbs, wine as disinfectant, etc. Pretty basic. One can imagine the fear of a wounded soldier, not only of the infection, but, well, the treatment too. There was, of course, no antibiotic, except perhaps honey or vinegar on wounds. For serious injuries, survival was often just luck. But finally, let's talk about what may be the most intense part of the soldier's experience, the actual combat and its aftermath. All the training and routine ultimately led to moments of brutal collision with the enemy. What was it like for the Roman soldier to go into a battle? A Roman soldier fought in formation, shield to shield with his comrades. But once the swords were drawn, it often became a chaotic and deeply personal struggle. Ancient battles were up close and bloody. Just imagine it. The noise, the horns blaring, officers shouting commands, hundreds of men charging or clashing shields. Stepping on top of some poor soul who's suffered a wound is screaming below you. Death everywhere. It's hard to forget that. The Roman soldier would throw his pilum from perhaps 15-20 yards out, and then draw out his gladius and clash with the enemy. The gladius, a short sword about a 50-centimeter blade, was a fearsome weapon in close quarters, designed to stab in the gaps of the enemy's armor under the rib cage. Roman soldiers were taught to aim for the abdomen if possible. We have many accounts of the effectiveness of Roman sword blows. For example, at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, the Romans had to fight through the pikes of the Macedonian phalanx. Once they got in close, Livy says that the Romans hacked at the knees of the Macedonians, hamstringing them. Combat was not a continuous melee. It often involved surges and pauses. In manipular legions, small units could rotate. A tired front man could swap with a fresh man from behind if the fight stalled. Polybius actually describes how, in extended fights, Roman ranks would exchange places, so no single man fought until total exhaustion. Nonetheless, the stress and physical exhaustion were certainly immense. Men were pushing with shields, shoving, slipping on the blood-soaked ground perhaps, and deafened by the screams of the wounded and dying. The smells of sweat, blood, and dust, or mud, filled the air. It was in those moments where that discipline, that training had to take over. A soldier had to trust his comrades and his officers, hold the line, and keep his wits. The carnage of ancient battles was, of course, unimaginably horrific. A vivid description comes from Livy's account of the aftermath of Cannae, one of Rome's worst defeats. He writes that even the Carthaginian victors were appalled by the scene the next day. This is the passage from Livy. There all those thousands of Romans were lying, infantry and cavalry, indiscriminately. Some covered with blood raised themselves from among the dead around them, tortured by their wounds. Some they found lying with their thighs and knees gashed, but still alive. These bared their throats and begged to have their blood drained. This gruesome image of fatally wounded soldiers, unable to move, pleading for a quick death. That's the reality of a battle. That's the reality of war. Livy continues, some Romans even had suffocated themselves by digging their heads into the earth, taking their lives to escape pain. In one case, a Numidian soldier was found alive under a pile of bodies with his face mutilated. A dying Roman, too weak to fight with arms, had literally torn at the Numidian's face with his teeth in rage. That's from Livy 22:51-9, for anyone who wants to go and look at that. Jeez. These certainly are exceptionally gory details, aren't they? But they remind an audience that for a Roman soldier, the reality of combat was not a clean duel of heroes, but more of a desperate struggle for survival in a hellscape of screaming and dying men. For those who survived the battle, the day didn't end with the enemy's fight. Victorious soldiers might pursue the fleeing foe, Or they might start the grim work of checking the fallen, looking for wounded comrades to rescue or dispatching wounded enemies. They also engaged in looting once the battle was won. Stripping armor and valuables from the enemy corpses was a common practice, and indeed a reward from battle. A Roman soldier, especially in the late Republic, hoped to gain some spoils. A nicer sword, a bit of jewelry, coins. Just pick it off the enemy's body. After a big victory, the general would collect a portion of the loot to distribute as bonus pay or gifts to the legion. This could be significant, for instance, after conquering rich cities in the east. Troops were often given hefty rewards. Conversely, in defeat, soldiers might be the ones left on the field. Roman discipline was such that many would stand and die where they were if surrounded. Those who could escape lost battle often regrouped at some rally point or fled to a nearby town. Being a defeated soldier was perilous. If captured, you might be killed or sold into slavery. That's quite right. Romans were slaves too, if they were unlucky. Hannibal, after Cannae, famously released many allied prisoners without ransom in a gesture, but many others were not so lucky. After battle, if the army held the field, they would perform the solemn task of burying or burning the dead, at least their own, and Romans took this seriously. Proper burial was a religious duty. After all, the gods are watching. After a mass cremation would be arranged for the fallen Romans, the enemy dead might be left for carrion, or buried in pits. The wounded were tended by medics. Field surgeries would commence. Amputations of shattered limbs, extraction of arrowheads, bandaging cuts. This was done without modern anesthesia, of course. Wine or vinegar might dull the pain a little bit. There's no surprise that many soldiers feared a crippling wound more than death. One aspect of Roman military life that might surprise us is the capacity to recover and simply keep marching on after horrific battles. Survivors had no time for trauma. They had to obey orders and continue the campaign. After all, another battle is just around the corner. Livy marvels at Roman resilience. After defeats like Cannae, Rome raised new legions and eventually won the war. He said, no other nation could have suffered such a tremendous series of disasters and not been overwhelmed. Part of that resilience was at the individual soldier's level. Those who lived had to incorporate those experiences, mourn lost comrades perhaps, but keep fighting regardless. Well, in summary, a Roman Republic soldier's everyday life was a combination of the commonplace and the extraordinary. On one hand, it included standard camp tasks like digging, marching, standing watch, preparing simple meals, activities that are not all that dissimilar from military life in our modern era. Soldiers laughed with their comrades, grumbled about their aching feet or lackluster rations, and eagerly anticipated the few joys of camp, like a flask of wine, playing dice in their free time, or writing a letter back to their loved ones. However, the same men took part in horrific violent incidents that had far-reaching ramifications. They still persevered with a stoic attitude, molded by tradition and discipline. As we read, the character of service changed over the course of the Republic, but the professional legionary who might serve a few years in Spain, Greece, or Gaul replaced the early citizen soldier, who fought for a season close to home. But one thing that did not change was the Roman values of officium, disciplina, and virtus, duty, discipline, and valor. An honorable death was preferred to shame, and a Roman soldier was supposed to be eager for courage. Virtitus studiosus, Examples of this ethos can be found in many ancient sources, whether they are historical, such as the centurion who held a bridge at Valencia, Spain, all by himself until help arrived, or Caesar's centurion Cassius Scaeva, who, according to Suetonius, fought on with one eye and multiple wounds, holding his post against all odds. Or there is the legendary accounts, such as Decius Mus's devotion, who ritually sacrificed himself in battle in the 4th century. These were regular men who accomplished remarkable feats. The victory was a single, glorious day that was frequently followed by a discharge and integration into society. After the wars, the majority of soldiers, particularly in the early republic, simply returned to their jobs as farmers, builders, or craftsmen. They brought with them the memories of adversity and friendship. In one of his speeches, Cato the Elder mentioned an elderly soldier in the Forum who had numerous scars running the length of his torso, each of which told a tale of his service to the Republic. These stories, the early morning exercise, the clang of the blacksmiths fixing weapons at dusk, the taste of the dusty bread on a long march, the rush of adrenaline as the battle line advanced, the terror of witnessing a friend fall, the comfort of a warm fire after surviving another day, and the obedience to the centurion's call. We've heard them all today. I appreciate you listening to this, getting this far. I hope you got a better understanding of the commonplace bravery of the legionaries of Rome. We examined their daily lives and paid tribute to the innumerable unnamed soldiers who with a shovel and a sword created the legacy of the Roman Republic, in addition to the well-known historical figures. And so, with that, I bid you Valete. Goodbye. But first, it's not over yet. I have to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMS HH, Crystal, and Talvery. And as usual, as I say every time, if you like the comments, what am I saying? If you have liked the content, leave a comment, do all the things that engage, do the engagement, all that, like and subscribe, you know what it is. Or even visit the Patreon, where there's a few little goodies waiting for you. Good night and lots of love to you all.